the NHL signed a new media rights deal in Canada. There. It brought me back to my time in Montreal. A couple things that you may not have known about Canadian baseball teams, as an example. There used to be something called the Currency Equalization Program. And that is when the Expos and Blue Jays got paid by baseball because there was a problem with the weakness of the Canadian dollar. And so all of our expenses were in Canadian dollars, non-player expenses. We paid our employees in Canadian dollars, our concessionaires in Canadian dollars. All of our revenue was in Canadian dollars, tickets, food, bev, parking. But players are US dollars. So there's a real disadvantage to be in Canada when you had to compete with US teams who were getting US dollar revenue locally, and we were getting Canadian revenue locally. And so we were made somewhat whole. That rule disappeared when teams in Major League Baseball were tired of handing money over to the Blue Jays and to the Expos. And now there is a similar situation happening where there is a huge problem with Canadian teams in hockey. The Blue Jays are still at a disadvantage. There is an exchange rate issue. When you've got a package to sell, you've got your media rights, you've got any sort of national sponsorships or international sponsorships, the North American sports, NFL, NBA, MLB, they don't focus on the Canada rights. It's a part of what they do, but it's a tiny little part, not meaningful. The NHL is totally different. When they are doing a TV deal in Canada, it is a huge, huge deal. It's bigger and always has been than the US TV deal. Canada, its sport, it's hockey. When the NHL signed this new deal, they signed a 12-year, $7.7 billion deal with Rogers. People may know Rogers Communications. You may know Rogers owns the Blue Jays. But what Rogers really does, other than figuring out if they're going to sign Guerrero, is they are a cable company for all intents and purposes. So when they sign a deal like this, you may be thinking, that seems like a heavy price to pay. But Rogers looks at it the same way Disney or Warner Brothers Discovery or NBC or CBS looks at getting the NFL or looks at getting the NBA. It is a huge block of programming. It is a huge number of hours because there are so many Canadian teams, and those Canadian teams, including Winnipeg, who you wouldn't think would have a team number one, and you wouldn't think they'd be good because you don't remember them ever being good. And then you look at the standings, and they're the best team in hockey. But people were wondering to Gary Bettman, I'm not sure I understand. Why did you do a deal like this? Why didn't you try to do an international deal with a US streamer like a Netflix or an Amazon or an Apple? Why didn't you try to do a deal with Disney? And Gary Bettman addressed this straight on, and I give him a lot of credit. He said that all of you who are impugning my ability to negotiate media rights deals, you're all Americans. You're not focused on the fact that US media rights and the marketplace in the United States is totally different than Canada. And he's 100% right. Back in the day, we would have a pretty big sized Hispanic marketing department in Miami. And even when we were playing at Pro Player Stadium. And I never liked calling it the Hispanic marketing department or the Latin marketing department because there are no scenarios where you market to Cubans, Venezuelans, Mexicans, and Dominicans the same way. They're all different people. They all respond to different marketing. You have to actually have marketing plans that are specific to each demographic. It's like saying that you can market the same way to a city versus a country, atmosphere, and group of people. It doesn't resonate the same. And for National Hockey League and Gary Bettman to recognize that dealing with Canada is different than the US, that ought to be like page 2 of your job description. But the reason that he felt that it was noteworthy and needed to tell you that he was actually doing his job well is that he had to come out ahead of the story to try to deflect some of the criticism that came with doing this deal with Rogers. I must say that when you're thinking about a broadcast deal in Canada, you go to the biggest player in Canada, and that's Rogers. And if Rogers is willing to pay that amount of money for exclusivity and to take all of the Canada from Montreal all the way to Vancouver, you're going to do more than consider it. You're going to do it. The problem with the NHL being so reliant on Canada is that they've got a small problem there. It's not that Trump wants them to be the 51st state. That's not actually it. The problem really is what's going to happen if the Canadian economy goes into the tank following the US economy, which is being pushed into a recession by tariffs and various other economic policies that are existing in the US right now. And if Canada goes into a recession, then that is going to have quite a deleterious impact on the business of the NHL in a much greater percentage than on the business of the other sports teams. And so therefore, it was incumbent upon him to figure out a way to try to mitigate the impact that a recession or the impact that Canada could feel by actions in the US. Therefore, the pressure to do this deal was greater. The pressure to get it done faster existed. And frankly, Rogers felt this made sense. And that's how deals happen. When both sides have a sense of urgency, when both sides feel like it's the right move for them, it becomes easier to get something accomplished. And so it did. The NHL made sure that as part of this deal, that they've got some carve-outs. They have some abilities to figure out what they can do to monetize other things. And that becomes very important. So, for example, they can make more money when Rogers does a deal in Quebec because there's going to be a French deal, whether it's with Réseau des Sports or anybody else, any other French network. The NHL had to be clear that we want to share in what you're doing when you sub-license out our games to French-speaking people in Canada. It's the same concept when ESPN got all the CFP games. You may remember this. And then they licensed out a bunch of them to Warner Brothers Discovery. These sort of sub-license deals and revenue sharing are extremely common. And they're very smart to do if you are Gary Bettman in the NHL.